There is a particular hour, familiar to almost everyone, that tends to arrive somewhere around 2 in the morning. The room is dark, the world outside has gone quiet, and yet the mind, which by every reasonable law of biology should be resting, is wide awake, replaying a sentence we said 6 hours ago, or rehearsing a conversation that has not yet happened, or turning over, for the 100th time, a decision that was actually settled weeks ago. We call this overthinking, and we tend to speak of it apologetically, as though it were a minor character flaw, a kind of mental clumsiness we should be able to correct with enough discipline or enough sleep. But overthinking is rarely a failure of intelligence. It is, more often, intelligence without an off switch. The very same machinery that allows us to plan, to anticipate danger, to make sense of a complicated world, refusing to stop running once the problem in front of it has been solved. This is a film about why the mind so often works against its own peace, and what a slightly older, calmer tradition of philosophy might have to say about learning to live with a mind that will not, on command, be quiet. The evolutionary logic of a mind that won't stop. To understand overthinking, it helps to remember that the brain was not designed for comfort. It was designed for survival, in an environment considerably more dangerous than the one most of us now occupy. For most of human history, a mind that replayed a threatening encounter over and over, turning it around, extracting every possible lesson from it, was a mind more likely to avoid the same danger next time. The ability to simulate a bad outcome in advance, to imagine every way a plan could fail, was not a defect. It was quite literally a survival advantage. Our ancestors, who worried too little about the rustle in the grass, did not, on the whole, live long enough to pass on their calm. The trouble is that this same machinery, so useful against predators, has not been updated for the modern world, where the threats we now face are far more often social and abstract. An email we have not yet answered, a remark that might have been misread, a mistake made 3 years ago that no one but us remembers. The brain, unable to distinguish between a genuine emergency and an awkward text message, applies the same intensive threat analysis to both. We are, in this sense, using a smoke detector calibrated for forest fires to monitor a kitchen toaster. The illusion of control. There is a second reason overthinking persists so stubbornly. It offers, however falsely, the comforting sensation of control. To sit with an unresolved problem and do nothing about it can feel unbearably passive. Overthinking gives us the feeling of doing something, of working on the problem, even when, in truth, no new information is being gathered and no real progress is being made. We mistake the repetition of a worry for the solving of it, in much the way a person might mistake pacing back and forth in a waiting room for a form of medical treatment. The philosopher Seneca, writing to his friend Lucilius nearly 2,000 years ago, observed that we suffer more often in imagination than in reality, that the anticipation of a difficulty tends to cost us more distress than the difficulty itself, once it actually arrives. Overthinking, in this light, is a kind of down payment on suffering we may never even need to spend, an advance installment of pain, paid eagerly, often for a bill that never comes. Why intelligent people overthink more? It is worth pausing here to note an uncomfortable irony. Overthinking tends to worsen, not improve, with intelligence. A person who thinks carefully about the world is also, almost by definition, a person skilled at generating alternative explanations, hidden consequences, and less flattering interpretations of events. This is an enormously useful skill in a laboratory or a courtroom. It is far less useful at 11 at night, turned inward on a single sentence spoken carelessly at dinner. The same capacity that allows someone to notice nuance in a novel or subtlety in an argument also allows them to notice 17 different ways a friend's slightly flat tone of voice might have signaled disappointment. Marcel Proust, a writer who understood better than almost anyone the exhausting richness of an overactive inner life, filled thousands of pages with the minute textures of memory, jealousy, and anticipation precisely because his mind refused to let any feeling pass by unexamined. It made him one of the great novelists of the 20th century. It also, by his own account, made him a man who could barely leave his room. Sensitivity of this kind is rarely free of cost. IV. The difference between thinking and ruminating. It would help, at this point, to draw a distinction that everyday language tends to blur. The difference between thinking and ruminating. Thinking, properly understood, moves. It gathers information, considers options, and eventually arrives somewhere, even if that somewhere is only a clearer understanding of the problem. Rumination, by contrast, circles. It revisits the same handful of thoughts again and again in the same order without ever producing anything new. It has the appearance of thought, the furrowed brow, the internal monologue, without any of its productive motion. This is why overthinking so rarely resolves anything, even after hours of apparent effort. A mind that ruminates is not solving a problem, it is replaying it, the way a scratched record replays the same few seconds of a song, mistaking repetition for progress. The tragedy of rumination is that it borrows the feeling of diligence, of taking a matter seriously, while producing none of diligence's actual results. V. The fear behind the noise beneath most overthinking, if we are honest with ourselves, sits a quieter and more uncomfortable fear. The fear that if we stop turning a problem over in our minds, we might be forced to accept that we cannot fully control the outcome. This is at its root a fear about the limits of our own power. Overthinking a decision we have already made is often an attempt to retroactively guarantee that it was the right one. To think our way into a certainty the future has simply not yet provided. Overthinking a conversation is often an attempt to make sure we were not, and will never be, misunderstood. In both cases, the mind is straining against something no amount of thought can actually deliver. Certainty, in a world that rarely offers it. The Stoics again have something useful to offer here. Epictetus drew a sharp line between what is within our control, our judgments, our efforts, our intentions, and what is not. The opinions of others, the outcomes of events already set in motion, the past. Overthinking, from this perspective, is often energy spent lobbying for control over the second category, using tools that only work on the first. It is in a sense a mind trying to negotiate with a fact that has already been settled. VI. Why distraction doesn't work. And what does? The common advice for overthinking is to distract yourself, to busy the mind with something else until the difficult thought passes. This can help in the short term, but it rarely resolves anything, because a thought that has not been properly attended to has a habit of returning, usually at the least convenient hour, having lost none of its urgency in the meantime. A more durable approach, favored by philosophers long before modern psychology arrived at similar conclusions, is not to suppress the thought but to give it a fixed, limited appointment. Seneca and later thinkers in his tradition would set aside a specific portion of the day to reflect deliberately on their worries and failings, not to avoid them, but to contain them, so that the rest of the day might be lived without their constant intrusion. The unstructured mind treats every hour as available for worry. The disciplined mind assigns worry its own room and closes the door on it for the remainder of the house. Writing serves a similar function. To put a worry into words on a page is to give it a fixed external shape, to stop it from drifting, formless, through every corner of the mind. Montaigne wrote his essays largely as a way of thinking on paper, discovering, again and again, that a thought written down loses some of the menace it held while it was still only circling, unexamined, in his head. Making peace with an active mind. It would be a mistake, though, to end this discussion by treating overthinking purely as a problem to be solved, as though the goal were to arrive one day at a mind that is perfectly, permanently quiet. Such a mind, if it existed, would likely also be a duller one. The same imaginative capacity that keeps us awake rehearsing an awkward conversation is the one that allows us to plan carefully, to empathize with people whose experiences we have never had, to notice details others miss. The goal, then, is probably not to silence this capacity, but to house-train it, to teach it when its efforts are welcome and when they are simply spinning in place, and to develop, slowly, the confidence to let a thought go before it has been fully resolved, trusting that most of what we fear turning out badly will, in fact, turn out to be perfectly survivable. Reflective, warm, perhaps then, the next time we find ourselves awake at 2 a.m, replaying a sentence that cannot be unsaid, or a decision that has already been made, we might try extending ourselves a small piece of the compassion we would offer a friend in the same position. A recognition that this restless energy, however unwelcome at that hour, is not proof of weakness, but the overspill of a mind that has simply never been taught where to put its considerable care. The aim is not to think less. It is to learn, with practice, where thinking is actually useful, and to have the grace, when it is not, to let the thought pass by unattended, the way one might let a car go by on a street one has no need to cross.